Welcome to week 2 in terms of our ongoing AP review for the AP exam, which again has changed drastically into the 45 minutes of who knows what, but otherwise I'm just covering what you would normally do for the AP exam because ultimately if you have these skills down, you should be able to pass it regardless, right? So again, this one's on synthesis. It's going to be about the strategies, the tips, the mindset you should have in order to score a 6 out of 6, but let's talk about AP exam for a second. If you're doing a research paper for high school, for college, for anything you're doing your thesis, maybe for your master's, what have you, this is going to help you a lot in terms of just getting a foundational skill for writing research papers. What you write in high school is going to be a lot shorter than you do in later parts of your academic career, but otherwise it's still the same format for the most part. It's about clarity and getting your ideas across. So without further ado, I want to get started with the items in the drive right now. These 5 items should be all the items that you should be using for the synthesis review. The lectures in there, the 2016 synthesis prompts in there, which is the one that we're working on. Practice work 3, which is going to include vocab and a couple of questions for you. College Board has a practice one. I'm going to have you try out and see if you can do synthesis on your own, if you choose to do so. And then the last one is just on the very right side of this image here. What are the readings on the AP exam? 2 of them actually are not available. One I provided a link for, and then the other one I just copied on the actual editorial itself. So those are the items to consider for usage here. Now let's talk about research papers, right? Because ultimately there's a plan of attack for how to write this paper altogether. And I kind of broke it down to 4 different parts for you to consider so that when you really do a synthesis essay or you're doing a research paper at home or whatever, you start from step 1 going all the way down to step 4, right? So the very first one is just make sure the essay centers around a topic that you can, 1, answer, problem solve, suggest a solution. Like, a lot of people mess up with their essays for research because they just put a statement there. And what that means is you're basically proving something that's been proven already. Or you're basically saying that this fact is true. And we're kind of like, yeah, we know, you know what I mean? There's nothing new there. So in this case, it should be something that you can take a stance on, or you can offer a solution for, you know what I mean? Something that you can actually propose a certain stance on. At the second part of it all, it has to be something you can provide and utilize evidence from research, whether it be anything from, for research papers, not as much, right? But you can do anything from the anecdotal level, like observational level, to the intensive readings, data, whatever, to prove your point. So everything for research papers should be something that you can prove with particular tidbits, little bits of information here and there. Secondly, for writing a research paper, you want to consider the sources you've selected and consider what types of evidence you're compiling. Like I mentioned earlier, anecdotes are usually not the best types of evidence for research papers. So in this case, you want to consider, well, where are my sources coming from? Is it something with good enough ethos? Does it actually provide something to prove my point? You know what I mean? You want to make sure that all your sources are selected for very particular purposes. Next, organize your evidences, because in synthesis, it's not just one paragraph, one evidence. It's actually merging a bunch of evidences together, because evidences, for the most part, they have trends, or you make your points regarding them. A rule of thumb for this, at least for AP exam, every paragraph should include 2 evidences that work with each other. So I'll give you a really easy example in terms of how to synthesize. Anytime you do like a compare or contrast paper between like 2 different works, we did one actually for semester 1's final regarding Grave of the Fireflies and Tim O'Brien's The Things I Carried. I basically asked you to synthesize the 2 evidences, the 2 sources there, and I want you to see the relationship between the 2 and to make a point regarding those 2. You're basically doing that, but with multiple sources in that regards there. So organize your evidences to kind of make sure that you see semblance and resemblance with each other, or even counter arguments that you can pit each other against. It's all about proving a point per paragraph. And then lastly, before you actually write the research paper itself, make sure you outline it, just because you want to make sure you have your thesis, your introductory paragraph, your topic sentences, and then like a general overview of all your evidences, right? Like if you saw the argumentative videos, once you have an outline done, the entire essay is pretty much done. At that point, all you need to focus on are like transitions, stronger writing choices. That's it. Like the information should all be present by the time the outline is done. So it's the same rubric. AP Lang always does the same 3 points that, I mean, universally they work. I wouldn't scale it the same way they do necessarily, but otherwise it's, again, thesis, evidence, sophistication, right? So in this case, do you have a clear thesis? Do you have a stance? Do you have evidence that supports each other? At least 3. They ask for at least 3 of the sources they give you. It's suggested you do more than 3, but otherwise at least 3 to earn the full points. And sophistication is always like a tricky one up in the air, but it kind of just boils down to like smart or clever writing choices, which we'll kind of go into a little bit in a second here. So thesis, I mean, we talked about this in the argumentative essay. This is part of the AP Lang's rubric regarding synthesis. I don't want to go too much into it, but otherwise, if we just look at how you earn this point here on the right side, basically they want you to respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a defensible position. Like I mentioned earlier, something that you can have a stance on, something that you can propose a solution, something that you can defend with evidence here. On the bottom of the right, it says response to the prompt rather than restate or rephrase the prompt, and the thesis clearly takes a position rather than just stating that there are pros and cons. And that's a danger that a lot of people run into when they're writing thesis statements or writing an argumentative paper, synthesis paper. They just kind of list like, there are 2 sides to every coin. And it's kind of like, yes, but can you pick a side and argue that that side is more worthwhile, or that's a side that we can choose over the other for XYZ reasons? You know what I mean? So in this case, you don't want to just be neutral for your stances. That's not a stance whatsoever. That's just being observatory regarding the situation, but not having any input whatsoever. Evidence is trickier. This is a big-ass rubric, but what I want to focus on is the 4, because anything that is in the 4 category usually just boils down into the 3 and 2s of less and less and less, right? So you need to do 2 things in synthesis essays. Number 1, evidence, right? Provide specific evidence from at least 3 of the provided sources to support all claims in a line of reasoning. The first part of that is easy. 3 evidences, that's all you need. That's not hard whatsoever. But the harder part of that is to support all claims in a line of reasoning, meaning that your evidences aren't just arbitrarily put there. You got to make sure there's transition or some sort of backing up with each other. They're not just 3 randomly chosen sources. There should have been a clear usage for all 3 that you've done. But otherwise, that's not too hard, right? You can do single evidence at least for papers altogether. Commentary consistently explains how the evidence supports a line of reasoning. Now, this one's a little trickier because the language is sparser down here, but it asks for a lot more, actually. So in this case, you're constantly having to explain this evidence and how it supports your point of view. So I'll give you an example in a second, but basically it's kind of like you can have all the evidence in the world, but for each one that you bring in, can you tell me why you're using it, what's important about it, what does it do for your argument, and so forth. So they give you a few more points on the bottom here, very bottom right, typical responses that earn 4 points. 1, uniformly offer evidence to support claims. Uniformly is tricky because it means that you're not doing like a big ass body paragraph and at the very end you put like your 2 sources really quickly. It should be in a way where they're actually used organically, which means like naturally, and it should just be part of the arguing process, right? You're making your point, I got evidence, I'm explaining my evidence, you know what I mean? Like there should be a structure to it all. Number 2, focus on the importance of specific words and details from the sources to build an argument. This one is based on close reading. So your evidences can't just be like, oh yeah, they said this in this source. And it's kind of like, yeah, I believe you, but is there anything specific in that source that you want to pull out? Quotes, data, having a better paraphrase of the author's point of view. We want that in your essay and the body paragraphs there. And number 3, organize and support an argument as a line of reasoning composed of multiple supporting claims, each with adequate evidence that is clearly explained. This one here is just kind of like showing continuity. So it's like, think of it this way. If you have one really strong body paragraph where 2 evidences are put well with each other, the next one should also be like that, and the next one and so forth. You can't just have like a really good first body paragraph and the other ones are really shitty. You know what I mean? They should all be consistent in terms of its quality control. So evidence, we'll talk about it real quick. I have a video I want you to watch as part of the slides themselves. You can look at both links. The first one is the actual crop video itself. The second one, if you want to watch the entire video, that's an option too. But I mean, we watched John Oliver before in my class, and the times we watched it, I believe it was based off of pennies, and it was in 2A about overconsumption. In this case, he's talking about the U.S. Census, which is kind of relevant because 2020, we are doing that census process. So basically, he will talk about what does it mean to do a census, what is a census, and a documentation of logistics. So at this point in the video, I would recommend you like pause real quick, watch this. It's like 2 minutes tops, right? But otherwise, he uses evidence in his his videos, his stand-up, his show, quite well. every time because he's always thinking about how to use his evidence for a particular purpose and transitioning and making a flow to everything he says. So pause real quick, watch that video, and then when you're ready, we're going to go to the next slide in a second here. All right? Pause. And then continue. All right, so same video. We're talking about the 2-minute clip you just watched. And I want to break down the evidences that he uses to talk about the census. So the very first thing he does is just explain what the census is, the importance of it, and then later, just give you some context, right? That's intro paragraph. Some people don't know what it is. Some people need some ideas regarding why is this important, why is this a topic. He does that in a few seconds. Boom, you know what the census is. It's documentation of all Americans, right? First evidence he uses, if you think back to what you just watched, the 1940s census training video. So it's a janky video. It's funny because the lady's response is kind of awkward, but it helps Oliver transition to his next point. We think that's what the census is, but it's a lot harder than you think, especially since the 1940s. So evidence 2, he mentions a little bit of logos, right? His transition is, well, let me show you how hard it is, and how much work is needed for this particular process. 250,000 regional offices, 500,000 temporary workers, 140 million households are mailed. So in this case, he even makes a point that it's the largest peacetime operation that the government does, and it helps you to this idea now of, buddy, if you thought it was a goofy process where people just walk around asking questions, it's a lot harder than you think. And with that, he even transitions to his next point. You thought it was hard before. In 2020, it's even harder because we have budget cuts and meddling. Transition to the next evidence. He gives a clip now of Trump's response about documented toilets and shit like that, right? And it's kind of like, well, here's my next point too of why the census is so confusing and difficult as a topic is because most Americans don't understand it. Even the guy who's in charge of things doesn't understand how it works. And it shows the sad irony of why it is so problematic and how we have these budget cuts just because people don't understand the importance of it. So in just 2 minutes, he has 3 very clear evidences, all linked with each other. That's basically one body paragraph in his mindset, right? In his show's progress. He's basically trying to let us know, hey, I'm trying to argue to you, census is important. Maybe you should participate in it. Let me give you some of the logistics in terms of how it works. So in this case, just be very clear and open-minded to how you use your evidences as you go along. And then later, what is this? Oh, yeah. So basically, my secondary point is just kind of it's a little just nuancy. The slide's kind of not optional, but just give you a little different view of evidence. It's difference between having evidence and using evidence. So 3 things I want you to consider whenever you have evidence put into your body paragraphs. Number 1, we do need context and information from you, but do not spend so much time summarizing. Get to the point. Whenever you write anything, this is why take-homes are important, because when you look at your body paragraphs, when you're reading it over with all the time in the world, look back to your evidence. Are you merely summarizing, or do you actually say something about that information? Whether you infer, or maybe you attach to a point you're making, or whatever, right? Some people just summarize and just give information, but they don't say anything about it, and it just sounds like you're giving me expository, informative essays, which we're not looking for here, right? Secondly, relate your evidences with each other. Like I mentioned earlier, Oliver basically tries to complement, transition, contrast, or whatever to other sources. Are you doing the same thing? Do your evidences actually relate to each other as you go along? I mean, maybe you haven't. Chance you haven't. If you watch the book review videos I gave you guys, for the first one especially, I tie everything back to the first reading of Franny and Zoe, for example. I'm not making an argument necessarily, but what I'm saying is this. All of the choices made were relevant and related to each other in theme at least, right? So in this case, as you're putting your evidences together or your items together, make sure there's a logic to it as you're going along. And then lastly, just make sure that why is information important? Just make that inference for both yourself and the reader. You personally need to infer the importance of your evidence and to make some sense with it to put into your essay altogether. There's sense in every source they'll give you, but you didn't make your own sense regarding it there. Sophistication is always really tricky, and I want to make this a 2-part video just because rubric's one part and the second part is actually going over essays and stuff like that. But sophistication, I can't really give clear example for this per se. I think the rubric gives you the criteria you should work on, and if you have any questions regarding it, go ahead and ask, but student samples kind of give you the idea too. But anyways, we'll go over the rubric real quick. So we'll look at the 1 point as to how to score it. Top right, demonstrates sophistication of thought and or a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation. Really broad, right? Not really sure what that means altogether. So we'll look at the criteria that they ask you to possibly delve into so you can earn the point here. So responses that earn this point may demonstrate sophistication of thought and or complex understanding of the rhetorical situation by doing any of the following. So it's mostly like one of the four, not all the four combined, but it's nice if you can like do two or so of the items here because they're kind of related in some ways. Number one, nuanced argument by consistently identifying and exploring complexities or tensions across the sources. In this case, you're not just putting like two sources together and your job is done here. You're basically saying, hey, I've combined sources A and B in the first body paragraph, but I'm not done with A or B, for example. I'll bring that up again to relate to C later on, or D or E or whatever in the later body paragraph. So basically, every evidence just is constantly living that you're always using it over and over. That one's tricky. It's doable, but you got to be very clear on the evidences that you're looking at. Number two, articulating the implications or limitations of an argument by situating it within a broader context. This is more safe for perhaps intro conclusion paragraphs, where it's kind of like, even though you're making this argument, what is the cutoff? What is the sort of limitation of it? Even though you make some really great points, what do you acknowledge as, well, it can't go past this line though, or this is as far as it gets. So in this case, it shows complexity because you actually understand the sort of like feasibility or human capacities that make it possible or hold it back. Number three, making effective rhetorical choices that consistently strengthen the force and impact of the student's argument. Write like an author, like I mentioned in the previous episode here. Don't write so like humdrum and boring. Actually make some rhetorical choices of like anything from rhetorical questioning to your own parallelisms to even imagery of the real world, for example. Any of that is fair game. And then lastly, 3 and 4 related, employing a style that is consistently vivid and persuasive. So it's again your structure, your rhetorical choices, your diction, your whatever, right? Just basically writing like an author. 3 and 4 are very similar in terms of that case there. And just keep this in mind that if you look at the very last part of additional notes, your sophistication can't just come from like one line in your essay. It should be like a chunk of it or like an overall theme to it, that you can't just write like a really smart line and your reader's like, oh, that was really good. Sophistication awarded. It doesn't work like that. It works where you're actually giving like a full-blown, well-written essay, and it's always well thought out and it's fluid for the most part, and they're thinking like, you know what, that was a good read. I appreciate that one. Boom, you get sophistication for that. So that's the rubric criteria. I'll go over the second part of the video in a second here, but otherwise, just keep that in mind, right? That's all that goes into a synthesis essay, but also a research paper.